And so when we hear and behold God's severity, we don't say, oh, indifferent. Never mind being amused or thinking, oh, they had it coming. Good on them. We don't either boast and say, well, that happened to them, but it'll never happen to us. This is verse 20. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, the Jews, take heed lest he also spare not thee. You don't say, look at these terrible things happen to them, but we're okay. We'll be all right. You say, oh, that could happen to us. And then, beholding God's severity, you tremble. You learn a little bit about God's fear. You say, I don't worship a God who's a kind of a puppet, a tickly sort of a God, an easy, friendly, comfortable sort of deity. You say, we worship the God who made heaven and earth, who is to be feared and revered as Lord. And if God didn't spare the natural branches, but inflicted upon them severity, justice without mercy, justice to the limits, then we take heed, lest he also spare not us. And they're the natural branches. And we're only wild ones grafted in. But there's the other side of it. There's also God's goodness. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness. Goodness describes the character of God as the absolute, moral, and ethically perfect one. The goodness of God means that he is infinite and beautiful in all of his ethical perfections, like faithfulness and mercy and kindness and justice and truthfulness. The goodness of God. And then, the goodness of God in this context refers not only to who God is in himself, but to a disposition and will in God to show love and pity and kindness and mercy. That's who God is, good. The goodness of God means, secondly, a disposition or will or choice to exercise this. And that thirdly leads us to his actual implementation and working of goodness. Because since that's God's character and since that's his will to his people, he doesn't stop short there. He actually shows it and demonstrates it and works it. And this showing of goodness we call benevolence, the doing of good. So that God is good and does good to his people in Jesus Christ. And the benevolence emphasizes too the rich and liberal giving of God to his beloved saints. So that God showers us with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places in Jesus Christ as a proof and manifestation of his rich love and mercy for those embraced in the Son of his love. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness. And just as we're to pause and think about God's severity upon the Jews who fall away in their generations, we're to think, as we don't do this half enough, we're to think, what has God done for us in Jesus Christ? He's grafted us into that one olive tree. And unless you're in that one olive tree, you perish everlastingly. He's included us so we're righteous and holy in his Son. And all of the life-giving sap comes to us. And what do we deserve? What were we? We were this wild olive tree. Useless thing growing way off in the hills. Growing wild. Without any pruning. Without any care. No one taking any interest in it. And bringing forth wild fruit. Bitter fruit. Fruit of wickedness and unbelief. The end of Romans 1 details the sort of fruit that wild olive tree Gentiles bring forth. Romans 1 verse 29 describes us as being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, and I'll stop because it goes on and on. And that's us. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. You've got to think. You've got to think. Goodness to me. That's me. That's where I was headed. And that being the case, if there's any real pausing and thinking about it, you're grateful. And you give thanks for the goodness of God to me, a miserable, wretched offender. This is the point of this passage, not just a sinner, but a Gentile sinner, grafted in, contrary to nature, into a good olive tree in my generations too. And then being grateful, this is the only way you can do it, because if you're not grateful you can't do this. Then being grateful, we've got to walk worthy and bring forth good fruit and love God and our neighbour and obey the Scriptures. So far we've seen severity in the Jews that fall away, goodness on Gentile believers, but following close upon the word of goodness to Gentile believers comes the warning to Gentile believers. On them which fail severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shall be cut off. And this reference to being cut off does not refer to believers personally. It's not teaching that true elect believers can utterly and finally fall away. Remember verses 4 and 5? God says, I have reserved to myself. God reserves, God keeps, God takes as his own peculiar possession and doesn't lose one. I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace. The election of grace means election and the preservation which keeps us in that faith to the very end. This passage, when it talks about being cut off, doesn't refer to an individual losing his salvation. It refers to believers being cut off in their generations. This is what God did to the Jews. Most of them. Cut them off. Sawed down branches rotting on the ground. And then you say, I'm not only to be grateful, I'm to fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Look what happened to the Jews. Have you got eyes to see? 2,000 years of it. And that could happen to me in my generations, in my church. That could happen in my congregation. That could happen in my denomination. And if you look around and see you, unless you're as blind as a post, you will be aware, since 2,000 years has passed, that this has happened not just to the Jews, this cutting off. It has happened to the Gentiles too. In fact, in terms of world population, it's far more evident actually with the Gentiles than the Jews, because it's happened in many, many countries. This letter was written to the Christians at Rome. God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. But what happened then? Where are they today? The seat of Antichrist on earth. Look at the mess they're in.